we need to completely readjust how we think about leadership to actually play for the game we're in. And the reason is important, because when we play with a finite mindset in the infinite game, there's a few very predictable things that happen. There's a decline of trust, there's a decline of cooperation, and there's a decline of innovation. I had a real-life experience that showed me what the difference between the two games was. I spoke at an education summit for Microsoft. I also spoke at an education summit for Apple. At the Microsoft Summit, I would say that 70 to 80% of the executives spent about 70 to 80% of their presentations talking about how to beat Apple. At the Apple Summit, 100% of the executives spent 100% of their presentations talking about how to help teachers teach and how to help students learn. One was obsessed with where they were going, the other one was obsessed with beating their competition. Guess which one was in quagmire? Guess which one was racing through the will and resources to stay in the game? At the end of my talk at Microsoft, they gave me a gift. They gave me the new Zune when it was a thing. This was Microsoft's answer to the iPod. This little piece of technology was absolutely fantastic. The user interface was simple. It was easy to understand. It was elegant. It worked flawlessly. It was a brilliant little piece of technology. I'm sharing a taxi with a senior executive from Apple after the Apple talk, and I couldn't help myself. I just had to stir the pot. So I turn to him and I say, you know, Microsoft gave me their new Zune. It is so much better than your iPod Touch. And he looks at me and he says, I have no doubt. And the conversation was over. Because an infinite player understands that sometimes you have the better product and sometimes they have the better product. And there's no such thing as winning or being the best. There's only ahead and behind. And the only true competitor in an infinite game is yourself. The goal is to make a better product this year than you had last year, to ensure that your culture is stronger this year than it was last year, that your leaders are growing at a stronger pace this year than they were last year, that everything about your organization, your systems, everything is improving, improving, and improving. It's constant improvement. There is no end to this game. It's a game of constant improvement. Which means if we have to completely reconfigure how we think about leadership for the infinite game, it begs the question, well, how are we supposed to lead in the infinite game? There are 5 things that have to happen to really become a leader for the infinite game. 1, you have to have a just cause. 2, you have to have trusting teams. 3, you have to have a worthy adversary. 4, you have to have existential flexibility. And 5, you have to have the courage to lead. That's what creating a circle of safety is. That's what a trusting team is, that people feel like they have control and agency over their own jobs. I spoke at a large energy company. I did a workshop with some senior executives at a large energy company in the United States, and it was an unbelievably hot room they had us in. So I asked something seemingly very obvious, do you think we could turn up the air conditioning? And we came back after lunch, and it was the afternoon, many hours since my request, and it was still unbelievably hot. And I said, were we able to turn up the air conditioning? And they said, yes, we told the facilities people here they had to send the request to headquarters in Houston. We're waiting for Houston to get back to us before they can turn down the air conditioning. That's the air conditioning. Imagine how the rest of that organization works. That everyone there is afraid to make a decision. No one has any agency or control. And there's one thing we know about human beings, that our sense of enjoyment from our work does not come from work-life balance and how much yoga we do. Our sense of enjoyment at work and the sense of stress we have is all about our sense of control. That when we feel like we have control over our work, we actually enjoy it more. And control is taken away from us, where we fear making any kind of decision whatsoever. That's what increases stress dramatically amongst human beings. If you want to play in the infinite game, you have to have trusting teams, people who are willing to help each other when things go wrong, people who are willing to admit mistakes, but if we can't keep the organization self-improving, it will break. Number 3, worthy rival. There's another guy who does what I do. He writes books. he does the speaking thing, and he's exceptionally good at what he does. He's incredibly well respected. I personally really admire his work, and I hate him. I'm not being funny. I actually hate him. He's never done anything mean to me. He's always been very polite and charming whenever I see him. It's irrational I hate him. What do you want me to tell you? And I will regularly go on the internet and check my book rankings and then immediately check his. I don't check anyone else's, just his. And if I'm ahead, I'm smug. And if he's ahead, I fume. And when people bring up his name, I sort of like, yeah, he's great. So we were invited to speak at the same event once, and I don't mean like him in the morning, me in the afternoon. I mean like on the stage, we were going to get interviewed together. And the interviewer thought it would be fun if we introduced each other. So I went first. I turned to him on the stage and I said, you make me incredibly insecure. I said, all of your strengths are all of my weaknesses. And whenever your name comes up, it makes me uncomfortable. He looked at me and he said, funny, I think the same about you. The reason I hated him had nothing to do with him. It's because he reminded me, he revealed to me, his very existence revealed to me my weaknesses. And it was much easier to take that energy and put it against someone than it was to admit to myself that I've got some work to do. It was an amazingly cathartic experience that day. I have never since checked his rankings. And I actually love him now. And I've stayed at his house and we talk to each other all the time. He's become a dear friend. I'm not going to tell you. There's a whole moral to the story that has nothing to do with who it is. It's fiction. Maybe it's all fiction. It's actually not. So I said the only true competitor in an infinite game is yourself. But what you have to have is a worthy rival. Someone who is better than you in your own industry, perhaps. Or in another industry who's better at something that you do. And instead of hating them and trying to beat them and trying to outdo them, we learn from them, we admire them, we respect them because by revealing to us our weaknesses, it gives us tools to go back and then see where we need to improve. And we wish them the best of luck. It's not about them, it's about us. Because the goal is not to beat them, the goal is to simply improve and stay in the game as long as possible. And if they drop out before us, so be it. The game will continue with them or without them. A worthy rival. Apple, in the early days, had IBM, Big Blue. IBM represented the Navy and Apple were the pirates. And then IBM dropped out of the game. Then it was Microsoft. Hi, I'm a Mac, I'm a PC. They represented the Navy and Apple represented the pirates. And then they dropped out of the game. And now it's Google and Facebook that Apple is pitting themselves against in terms of privacy and other things like that. A worthy rival reveals to us our weaknesses so that we may go back and improve. If we're obsessed with beating our competition, it's like running in a race and tripping the other competitor. You will win the race, but you're still a slow runner. And the problem is there's going to be another race and another race and another race and another race, and it never ends. Sure, you win a couple, but you're still a slow runner. The point is to get better yourself. Have a worthy rival. Know who they are. They can be companies. They can even be individuals at work. I completely am against the idea of creating internal competition. I hear this from companies all the time. We like to drive performance by pitting our people against each other. Well, that means they're going to undermine each other. I want my people to share information, not hoard it. I want my people to help other divisions, not complain about them. But rivalry is good. You can absolutely have rivals in your own company, people who you know are better at your job than you. People who are better leaders than you, that you look at them and say, I want to be like that girl. I want to be like that guy. They're so good. They make me insecure they're so good. Those are the people to admire. Have rivals, absolutely. Again, it's another tool for constant improvement, which is what we need in the infinite game. Number 4 is the capacity for existential flexibility. So there's something really funny when you think about what is existential if you compare finite games and infinite games. In a finite game, it's the game that ends. So the football game ends, but the players continue to exist until there's another game. They just wait to play another game, right? The game ends. In the infinite game, it's the players that disappear. The game is constant, but the players cease to exist. Companies go bankrupt. The Roman Empire doesn't exist anymore. The players disappear. So this concept of existential flexibility is literally existential. Can you stay in the game because you're the one that's going to disappear? The capacity for existential flexibility is quite simply a dramatic shift in strategy because you find a better way to advance your cause. So, in the early days of Apple, Apple had already come off the success of the Apple I and the Apple II. It's the late 70s, early 80s, and their next big computer was whatever they were developing. And coincidentally, Jobs and a few of his senior executives went to visit Xerox PARC, which was the innovation center for Xerox. And Xerox showed them a new technology that they had invented called the graphic user interface, where you didn't have to learn a computer language to use a computer, which is how it used to be, but now you could use this thing called a mouse, and you could move a cursor on a desktop and click on folders and move them around and things to use the computer. And Jobs saw this technology and thought this was amazing. If he's trying to empower individuals to stand up to Big Brother, this means that way more people would have access to the technology than the people who learn a computer language. And as they left Xerox PARC, he said to his guys, we have to invest in this graphic user interface thing. And one of the executives, the voice of reason, said, Steve, we can't. We've already invested millions of dollars and countless man-hours in a completely different strategic direction. If we abandon that, we'll blow up our own company. To which Jobs actually said, better we should blow it up than someone else. That decision became the Macintosh, a technology so profound that the entire software of Windows is designed to look like a Macintosh. The reason we all have computers at home and at work is because of that decision. To the outside world, it looks like you're crazy to do that you would risk the loss of money or the potential failure. Why would you abandon something that's working for something that might not work? But to the person who makes the decision, because they are driven by just cause, it is so easy for them to see that staying on the path they're on is the path that will lead to death. That this decision is the obvious choice, and the money means nothing, because it means survival and the ability to continue to thrive. Existential flexibility. So, George Eastman was also a visionary. He was a young guy working in a bank in Rochester, New York, and he decided he wanted to be an entrepreneur. He was 21 years old, something like that. And so everybody was land prospecting back in those days. It was like the .com. And so he wanted to become a land prospector. And so he was going to go on a trip to prospect land, and a colleague of his from the bank said, you should take a camera to take pictures of the land that you want to prospect for reference. The problem was, in those days, the main way you could take a picture was you had to hire a photographer. You couldn't take pictures of your own holiday, you couldn't take pictures of your own family. Only professional photographers could do that. So Eastman ended up not going on the trip, but he actually picked up the hobby of photography. And the problems are so complicated. He'd have to take all of these chemicals and these camera the size of a microwave oven and tents to load the film. And the guy was like, why can't it be a little simpler? This is ridiculous. I just want to take pictures for fun, and it's not my business. And so he figures out a way to coat the plates the film plate so he didn't have to deal with all the toxic chemicals out in the field. Turns out other photographers wanted his plates and they started buying them. So he improves upon the technology and he invents something called film, where now you could take 100 pictures on a flexible piece of film built into the camera. He flies to England to present his technology at what's their equivalent of a technology show. It was a big photography show here where people come from miles around to see whatever is latest and greatest. Like, what's the big thing in Vegas? Oh, what is it? CES, thank you. It was like CES. And it was a huge hit. Everybody thought this film thing was absolutely unbelievable. It was incredible. And nobody bought one. It was a complete commercial disaster, because the quality of the photographs wasn't good enough. They were too grainy, and for professionals, they needed high-quality film. Now, for any of us who are entrepreneurs who came up with the technology, the obvious choice would be to go back, improve the technology. The demand is like begging for your product. We just have to fix the technology, and we're good to go. That's not what George Eastman did, because he was obsessed with democratizing photography. And even if he got it right, how many professional photographers are there? He wanted to make it easier for the rest of us, just like he made it easy for himself. So he made an existential flex. He completely abandoned the professional market, and he said, you know, there's an entire market that doesn't care about the quality of the photograph, the general population. And they marketed the camera and the flexible film to the general population. It is because of George Eastman that we take our own pictures of our own families and our own holidays. George Eastman went on to build Kodak, a word he made up, by the way, because he thought K was a strong-sounding letter. And he went on to be one of the richest men in the world, up there with the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. Years later, a company that continued to be obsessed with the democratizing of technology, that had continued to make it easier and easier and easier for us to take pictures, in 1975, Kodak invented the digital camera. And when the young man who invented it showed it to the executives, first they complained about the quality of the picture. Then they said nobody wants to look at pictures on a screen. And then they decided to suppress the technology for fear that it would cannibalize film sales. And they built an entire company they made the paper, they made the chemicals, they made the machines, they made the film, all based on this one thing, and they couldn't imagine having to reconfigure their company for something different. They gave themselves 10 years. They knew somebody else would figure out the digital thing, and they gave themselves 10 years. And over the course of those 10 years, do you know what they did? Nothing. And yes, new technology started to emerge, and Kodak actually made billions of dollars licensing their patents for the digital camera. And then when those patents ran out, 3 years later, they went bankrupt, because they didn't have the capacity for existential flexibility. If you're not willing to blow up your company, the market will blow it up for you. That's exactly what happened. There was a limited runway. They had the cause. They chose to abandon the cause in order to do something finite, in order to do something to protect the certainty of the future versus doing something that they know is the right thing to do for the long term. That's the capacity for existential flexibility. Which leads to the final point, the courage to lead. I always joke that it's a little embarrassing that I have to have courage on the list. But the reason it's there is because everything that I have told you today is unbelievably difficult. All of the pressures in our lives, whether it's from the markets or from our families or from the incentive structures in our companies, are trying to force us to consider the finite. They're trying to force us to consider the short term over the long term, consider profit before people. And by the way, when I talk about putting people before profits, I don't mean like 1% profit, 99% people. Like, it can be like 51-49. It means there's a bias. It means that when there's a decision that we know that one of them is going to be sacrificed, we lean towards people. It doesn't mean we're anti-profit. Remember, to stay in the game, you need resources and the will to stay in the game. Profitability is important, but you have a bias for people. That's hard. That's hard. It's much easier to have redundancies rather than figure out a way to protect them. If you look at all the companies we admire, all of the ones that I would consider infinite leaders, Either they've never had redundancies, or they only used them very, very sparingly in extreme times, and they're very, very embarrassed that they did, and it was a complete shock to their system that they're still reeling from, and they admit it. That takes courage. Do you know how much courage it takes to make an existential flex with cause in mind? Why are you making this change? Because I have a vision of a future that's completely unrealizable. And that's why I'm going to change the direction of my company. Walt Disney did it. The guy basically invented animation like we have it today. He was the first one to put sound to an animation. He was the first one to make a feature-length animated film, Snow White, where you could be physically transported. But the problem was, once you were done with the film, it was over. He wanted to physically keep people in the movie, in the fantasy. And after all that success, no one would let him make the parks. And so he sold all of his interests in Walt Disney Animation, and he quit to start an entirely new company, and he had to self-fund it because he says he couldn't put up his dreams as collateral with the bank. They're not interested in his dreams as collateral. And that became Disneyland, which to this day makes, I think, more money than any other division in Disney, and continues to grow and grow and grow. It is infinite. Disneyland continues to improve. That was truly what his vision was. That takes courage to put it all on the line. It takes courage to say, I don't know what I'm doing, and the leader has to set the example. That's scary, because we think we have to have all the answers and we have to be tough all the time. To admit fallibility. It's hard to admit that there are other people out there that are better than us. We've all been in new business pitches, and somebody says, what about your competition? And we come up with some nonsense about how we're actually better than them. When deep down inside, we know they're so much better than us. I remember this back in the early days when I had a marketing consultancy before all the Y stuff and all this, the career I'm on now. And I remember I used to go into new business pitches, and I remember being so brutally honest. You know, I would say, I'm really good at this. I'm okay at this. You should not hire me for this. And they kept wanting me to hire me for everything just because I was honest. Because every other pitch that they had the day before, that other company was brilliant at everything. And even though they knew that I sucked at these things, they just knew I'd be honest when things broke. There's something to be said for honesty. We trust honest people. It's anthropological, it's biological, there's no escaping it. It goes back to early mankind. When somebody says there's danger, it has to actually be there. When somebody says there's no danger, you're fine, we have to actually believe them. That's why we take recommendations from close friends and not strangers. Like if some stranger walks up to you on the street and says, you should see this movie. But if your friend says, you should see this movie, you like rush out and buy a ticket. You don't even read the reviews. Trust. There's something to be said for honesty. It's hard being honest all the time. It's really hard. Do I look fat in these jeans? I like the other jeans better. Nobody said honesty has to be mean. The courage to lead fundamentally means you're willing to be open-minded, to consider that maybe, just maybe, the way you think the world works may be wrong. And the way we've been building our business based on all the social conventions and what everybody tells us are the right things to do maybe is wrong. And just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean it's right. Remember, the vast majority of the business philosophies and practices that we practice today are not norms of business. They're recent. They come from the 70s and 80s. The concept of shareholder supremacy, where we prioritize the interest of an external shareholder over the interests of our employers or customers, was a theory proposed in the late 1970s, popularized in the 80s and 90s by bastards like Jack Welch, who ran GE. The concept of using mass layoffs to meet an arbitrary financial projection at the end of the year did not exist prior to the 1980s. It was popularized by bastards like Jack Welch and General Electric. Rank and yank, the idea of ranking your employees based on performance, promoting the top 10% and firing the bottom 10% did not exist prior to Mr. Welch. And this man named Milton Friedman, an economist, they gave this guy a Nobel Prize. They gave Milton Friedman a Nobel Prize. He is credited with basically offering us what is considered the accepted definition of the responsibility of business. He said the responsibility of business is to maximize profits within the bounds of the law. What happened to ethics? Because ethics is a much higher standard than the law. The makers of the Titanic in the early 20th century built a ship that was 4 times larger than any other ship of the day. And the regulations that governed lifeboats were based on the size of the ship, and they didn't yet have a lifeboats for all provision. It said if your ship is this size, you need this many lifeboats. If your ship is this size, you need this many lifeboats. And their ship was 4 times larger than the largest. So they knew that eventually the regulation would catch up, that eventually you'd have a lifeboats for all provision in the law. But until it did, meh. Literally, to save money. That was their reason. To save money, they left empty berths on the Titanic where the lifeboats will go when the law catches up, but until then, we'll just put nothing. So they only had 25% of the required lifeboats for the number of passengers that were on board the Titanic. We all know what happened in 1912. It hit an iceberg. Do you want to guess how many people died? You're right, 75%. They broke no laws. Think about the number of CEOs that get dragged out in front of the court of public opinion after they've done something disgustingly unethical, and what do they all say? We were within bounds of the law. We broke no law. This is the standard for business? And so people who are anti-capitalist now, what they've completely failed to understand is that the capitalism we have is not actually capitalism as Adam Smith envisioned it. We have a bastardized capitalism. Capitalism for bastards, if you like. And the capitalism we practice today is not actually the purest form of capitalism. It actually undermines capitalism, where we have increasing levels of stress, we have declining levels of technology, declining levels of trust, declining levels of cooperation. We have unstable economies. Is because of this false view of capitalism that we have. As Adam Smith envisioned it, it was about trust, it was about cooperation, it was about human beings. He believed that you prioritize people over profit. He actually wrote in The Wealth of Nations that I don't need to speak any further about it, it's obvious. And then didn't write anything else about it. That's why we have to challenge the system. That's why we need an infinite mindset. That's why we have to have the courage to stand up to Milton Friedman and say, you're wrong, I don't care about your prize. Well, he must be right. It's to stand up to bastards like Jack Welch and people who've immortalized him. And to say, no, our form of capitalism prioritizes people, trust, cooperation, empathy, maternal instinct, longevity. Not the same as long-term or sustainable. I don't use the word long-term. 20 years is long-term. 30 years is long-term. Infinite. Which all raises a very interesting question. What does it mean to live an infinite life? Clearly, our lives are finite, but life is infinite. We are the players in an infinite game. We're born, we die, we come, we go. The game goes on with us or without us. The game doesn't care. And like the game of business, like the game of education, like the game of global politics, we do not get to pick the game, but we do get to pick how we play. That is the only choice we have. And if we choose to live our lives with a finite mindset, we're playing to win. We're playing for somebody else to lose. We're playing to advance our careers faster than everybody else, to make more money than everybody else. We're comparing the scores constantly. We're slicing and dicing to show that we're the best, we're number one. We get to make up the numbers and the time frames, but it's really important to us that everybody thinks we're number one. You don't build trust that way. Cooperation, hard to come by. Innovation, forget about it. You'll be rich, and then when you die, you don't get to take any of it with you, and we won't miss you. We'll forget your name, and your business will probably close right after you. Or if it doesn't, it'll go like this slowly. If it's large, it can afford to stay in business for a while, but that doesn't mean it's permanent. Or we can choose to live our lives with an infinite mindset, which means we give our businesses a cause worth coming to work for. We give our families a cause worth helping each other out for. We commit ourselves to being the leaders we wish we had. We commit ourselves to building circles of safety in which people feel safe and we trust each other. And we're willing to take risks, to be vulnerable, to set the tone. Because if we take care of each other, this can outlast me. We're willing to have rivals and be honest about our weaknesses and admit that there are other people who are much better at what we do than us. And we should learn from them. We're willing to make that massive shift if we find a better way to advance our cause. And we will have the courage to say to all the people who say that we're crazy, idealistic, yeah, we are. Yeah, I'll take my risk. Because fundamentally, that's what the infinite mindset is. It's a code for the idealists to operate in a world that is telling us we should be realistic. It's a code for people who believe that an unrealizable vision that's worth devoting our lives to advance is better than a short-term goal. The choice to live an infinite life means that we leave a legacy. It means that when we pass, others will pick up the torch and continue without us. I had a chance to sit next to Richard Branson at dinner once. And I asked him, when you die, how should we judge you? How should we judge your success? I asked him. I said, what did you do at Virgin that we will look back and say you were successful? And he said, do not judge me by anything I did at Virgin. If you want to judge my life, you judge me by the quality of my children. That's an infinite mindset. That is someone who's lived their life with the expectation that other people will carry a torch, and all of the foundations he laid were not for profit, they were not for fame, they were to keep the torch burning. The choice is ours.